to tell you how happy I was to receive the appointment. It's a beautiful piece of work. And I'm very grateful to the Vice Rector, Professor Rockenbach. I am very grateful to Andreas, to Professor Cooper, the former rector of the university, and to the organizers of Afrique Cologne Festival. When I got the letter from Andreas, I think I responded immediately, and I accepted to come to your beautiful city and to this very old institution. I understand from the vice rector and that it was closed by Napoleon, and that Mr. Adenauer responded very well to Napoleon's challenge and reopened this magnificent institution. I'm very happy to be here as you celebrate the 100th anniversary of this reopening. I would like to believe that bringing me here on this occasion is a step you undertake to open the doors of your institution to Africa. I would like to share with you a set of urgent reflections, all of which have to do with the now, with our global present. And when I say our global present, what I have in mind is the sustainability and the durability of our planet. As a matter of fact, the problem of our planet's sustainability is not only an intellectual, a political, or even an economic problem. It is an almost existential preoccupation which is increasingly expressed in many different and at times strident voices by various people, not only here in Germany, but all over the world. As it goes, we are increasingly awakening to the consciousness that our planet's life support system has been very seriously damaged by human activities. It is not only in a deep state of fragmentation, it is in dire need of repair. As it goes, and in the same token, many are wondering how should we inhabit it differently or anew and share it as equitably as possible among all its inhabitants, humans and non-humans. Many are also wondering how should we remember it, that is, put back together its different parts, reassemble it, and reconstitute it as an integrated system, a system in which humans, non-humans, physical, chemical, and biological components are all interlinked in a grand gesture of mutuality. These questions of inhabitation and interconnection, of repair and mutuality, of the interlacing of human history and Earth's history, these questions are far from abstract concerns. In fact, there is little doubt that they will be at the center of any debate on the future of life and the future of reason in this century. To properly attend to them, we need to focus our attention on their deep causes. I would therefore like to identify three of these because I believe that, more than many others, they may have an almost overwhelming bearing on what the planet we live in, which is the only one so far where life is known to exist, what that planet might become. The first mega process I would like to comment upon is the unprecedented consolidation of power and knowledge in the hands of private high-tech corporate entities whose sphere of action is not one country or one region, but the globe. To be sure, corporate sovereignty is far from new. It has taken various forms throughout history. Take, for instance, the English East India Company and its political dominance in some parts of the Indian subcontinent in the 18th century. A composite, diffuse, and hybrid entity, it exercised the kind of power customarily associated with formal state institutions. It could, for instance, acquire territories. It could engage in wide-ranging operations such as tax collection, war making, and in competition with the monarchical and national state, it was a key part of the different institutional forms that shaped imperial expansion. The conditions that have made possible the expansion of privatized government in the first half of the 21st century are very well known, and many of these have to do with the various legal frameworks behind international trade agreements, behind foreign investment treaties, and other mechanisms that have turned markets into the single most undisputed forces of our times. Others have to do with the computational transformations of financial markets and the possibilities afforded by media technologies. Most global corporations nowadays aspire to secede from everybody else while exercising surveillance on everybody else. Their big dream is to be exempt from taxes and to be free from accountability. In short, to enjoy the kind of immunity we used to recognize only to truly sovereign powers. In a recent book about what she terms surveillance capitalism, Shohana Zuboff argues that a global architecture of behavior modification is underway. Driven by powerful states, high-tech corporations, and military apparatuses, surveillance capitalism threatens what she calls human nature in the 21st century, just as industrial capitalism disfigured the natural world in the 20th. She shows the extent to which vast wealth is accumulated in what she terms new behavioral futures markets, that is, markets where predictions about our behavior are bought and sold, and the production of goods and services is subordinated to new means of behavioral modification. Indeed, capital, especially finance capital, has become our shared infrastructure, our nervous system, the transcendental mode that nowadays maps out our world and its psychophysical limits. And around us, it looks as if nothing escapes its control, affects emotions and feelings, manifestations of desire, dreams or thought. No sphere of contemporary life has been left untouched by the spread of capital. Late 21st century corporate sovereignty is therefore an unprecedented form of power whose main aspiration is to free itself from democratic oversight. As a result, many are wondering whether we might not be living in an epoch when sovereignty is no longer exercised by the demos. The second mega process I would like to invoke is technological escalation and the ways in which it has totally redefined the nature of speed, unshackled markets and the economy, and the way it constantly monitors our behavior in an attempt at revealing how it could be modified and optimized. As a matter of fact, some of the fastest expanding markets in the world today are markets for future behavior. They rely on better understanding incipient future intent. This could be future voting intentions, the intent to commit fraud, the intent to buy life insurance, or the intent to stream a specific video. These markets also rely on the extraction and mining of new forms of raw material. Such raw material mostly consists of information and details about individuals' behavior taken, as Zuboff writes, from the distant corners of our unconscious. It is raw material plumbed from intimate patterns of the self, our personality, our moods, our emotions, our vulnerabilities, every level of our intimacy. The purpose is not only to heighten the predictability of our behavior, it is also to make life itself amenable to datification. A key feature of our times is therefore the extent to which all societies are nowadays organized according to the same principle, the computational. If only because we are surrounded with ubiquitous computing technologies that weave themselves into the fabric of our everyday lives, devices, sensors, things we interact with, and which have become part of our presence in the world and all the time. And how the boundary between us and these devices is enacted is, of course, a matter of open debate. The third mega process I would like to comment briefly upon is what we should call the dialectics of entanglement and separation. All over the world, the combination of fossil capital, soft power warfare, and the saturation of the everyday by digital and computational technologies has led to the acceleration of speed and the intensification of connections, creating thus a new redistribution of the earth and of population movements. In the process, the human race has come up against terrestrial limits. Such limits are not only the consequence of the sphericality of the planet, they are also limitations on the expansion of life as such. As the planet increasingly seems bound to burn, it is not only the individuated bodies which are imperiled, it is earthly existence, the fate of everything on earth, the fluidity of life which is at stake. Meanwhile, we are more than ever before at any other time in human history, not only in close proximity to each other, but also exposed to each other. This close proximity and exposure is experienced less and less as opportunity and possibility, and more as heightened risk. But entanglement and exposure to each other are not all that characterize the now. Wherever we look, the drive is simultaneously towards contraction, towards containment, towards enclosure, and various forms of encampment, detention, and incarceration. Typical of this logic of contraction is the erection in countless parts of the world of all kinds of walls and fortifications, gates and enclaves. To this should be added various practices of partitioning space, of offshoring and fencing of wealth, of splintering territories, of fragmenting spaces, saddling them with various kinds of borders, whose function is to decelerate movement, to stop it in some instances for certain classes of people in order to manage risks. Numerous reasons are mobilized to account for this renewed infatuation with borders, borders taken as the best way to manage risks. Security and the preservation of one's identity are some of these reasons. As it happens, physical and virtual barriers of separation, digitalization of databases, the development of new tracking devices, sensors, drones, satellites, sentinel robots, infrared detectors, and various other cameras, biometric controls, new microchips containing personal details, everything is put in place to transform the very nature of the border in the name of security. Borders are increasingly turned into mobile, portable, omnipresent, and ubiquitous realities. The goal is to better control movement and speed, accelerating it here, decelerating it there, and in the process, sorting, recategorizing, reclassifying people with the goal of better selecting anew who is whom, who should be where, who shouldn't, all in the name of security. As a result, borders are no longer merely lines of demarcation separating distinct sovereign entities. Increasingly, they are the name we should use to describe the organized violence that underpins both contemporary capitalism and our world order in general. But perhaps, to be exact, we should speak not of borders in general, but instead of borderization, that is, the process by which certain spaces are transformed into uncrossable places for certain classes of populations, who thereby undergo a process of racialization, places where speed must be disabled, and the lives of a multitude of people judged to be undesirable are meant to be immobilized, if not shattered. Whatever the case, the technological transformation of borders is in full swing, and in a sense, one of the major consequences of the technological escalation I was talking about a moment ago has been the creation of a segmented planet of multiple speed regimes. A key development of late is the extent to which border security practices have taken a keen interest in the connection between the human body and identity as a means to achieve detailed control over movement and speed. This being the case, the question we must ask is the following. What precisely is at stake in the extension of the biometric border into multiple realms of social life, and in particular, the human body? In other words, what explains the migration from the border understood as a particular point in space to the border as the moving body of the undesired masses of populations? Part of the answer, it seems to me, is a new global partition between potentially risky bodies on the one hand and bodies that are not risky on the other. As you know, it is in the nature of risk to be hidden from view. That which is hidden from view is generally unknown. And for it to be known, it must be visualized. The screening of bodies at border checkpoints aims at making visible that which is hidden from view, opening up new visualizations of the unknown, potentially risky body. In such a context, biometric technologies are supposed to fragment the human body in order to recompose it for the purpose of securitization, that is, of elimination and neutralization of the risk. This happens because the human body is still seen as an indisputable anchor from which data can be safely harnessed or extracted. And as a result, we are witnessing a gradual intertwinement of individual physical characteristics with information systems, a process that has served to deepen faith in data as a means of risk management and faith in the body as a source of absolute identification. In this sense, biometric technologies are perceived as infallible and unchallengeable verifiers of the truth about a person, the ultimate guarantors of identity. They are supposed to produce the identification of a person beyond question. They're supposed to lend authenticity and credibility to all of the data that are connected to that identity. The belief being that the world would be safer if only ambiguity, ambivalence, and uncertainty could be controlled. The three processes I have briefly sketched are driving the movement towards what I have called planetary entanglement, as well as its opposite, enclosure, contraction, containment, encampment, and incarceration. I could give you figures here. There have never been as many people in prison in the world as now. Our world is, in fact, or in any case, looks like a vast archipelago of carceral spaces from that point of view. Now, let me come back to the comments I have just made about bodies. It seems to me that in relation to various human bodies, part of what we are witnessing is a double, apparently contradictory movement. On the one hand, we are witnessing a novel imbrication, a symbiotic merging of life and mobility. Indeed, for millions of people, to be alive or to survive today is more and more coterminous with the capacity to move, the capacity to get out, the capacity to leave places that have been made inhospitable. On the other hand, We are witnessing a bifurcation between life and bodies, if only in the sense that nowadays not everybody is thought of as containing life. Discounted bodies are believed to contain no life as such. They are, strictly speaking, bodies at the limits of life, trapped in uninhabitable worlds and inhospitable places. The kind of life they bear or contain is not insured or is uninsurable, folded as it is in extreme and thin envelopes. Such bodies on the precipice are the most exposed to droughts, storms, and famines, toxic waste, and various experiences of effacement. Their livelihoods made impossible, they are the most likely to sustain the most crippling wounds and injuries. Trapped human subjects, often without escape, they are caught in the various death management systems that saturate the contemporary world. They literally bear the brunt of terrestrial life on a damaged planet. At the same time, they exceed all attempts to contain them. These bodies are not simply in motion, they are movements and events. The inside of such bodies is not separated from their outward environments, and from the perspective of discounted bodies, to be alive is always and already to breach boundaries or to be exposed to the risk of the outside entering the inside. This disentanglement of life from discounted bodies, this redistribution of life on differential scales of insurability and non-insurability is, I think, a key dimension of contemporary migration regimes. Contemporary movement restrictions are not limited to national boundaries. They are at work at a global scale. They are deepening the space and time asymmetries between different categories of humanity, while leading to the progressive ghettoization of entire regions of the world. Furthermore, at a time when the material components and biological organization of the body can be re-engineered and redesigned, the latter are more than ever based on the ideas of repressive selection of species. In this context, borders are meant to concretize the principle of dissimilarity rather than that of affinity. They are not only obstacles to free movement, they are meant to act as boundaries between species and varieties of the human. As such, they play a crucial role in contemporary modes of production of human difference. Human bodies are increasingly divided between those that matter and those that do not. Furthermore, global perspectives on human mobility are increasingly refracted through those of fertility and mortality. Population politics is once again a cipher for broader geo-racial struggles. Population politics is nowadays expressed maybe not in the old terms of improving the species' genetic stock. Sterilizing the degenerate, the insane, or the criminal might no longer be on the agenda, but treating population as a matrix of different races still saturates contemporary global imaginary. In times of acute racial panic and fears of so-called race suicide, borderization might be the new form of negative eugenics. Perhaps more than at any other moment in our recent past, the population question is increasingly framed in terms of whether and how to get rid of certain classes of people deemed redundant or superfluous, in terms of what to do with those whose very existence does not seem to be necessary for our reproduction, or those whose mere existence or proximity is deemed to represent a physical or biological threat to our own life. In the context of neoliberal governmentality, the incontinent fecundity of the poor, women, or inhabitants of the global south is resurfacing and is now embedded in existential preoccupations concerning the ecological limits of the earth. Now, throughout history, and in response to this question, what should we do with people who happen to be in our midst, but whose very existence is a threat to ours? In response to this old question, various paradigms of rules have been designed. One historical response has consisted in putting in place spatial exclusionary arrangements. Such was, for instance, the case during the early phases of modern settler or genocidal colonialism in relation to Native American reservations in the United States. Such was the case of, historically, of island prisons, penal colonies such as Australia, camps and Bantustans in South Africa. A late modern example is Gaza in Palestine, and Gaza might well prefigure what is yet to come. Here, meaning in Gaza, control of vulnerable, unwanted, surplus, or racialized people is exercised through a combination of tactics, chief among which is modulated blockade. A blockade prohibits, obstructs, and limits who and what can enter and leave the strip. The goal might not be to cut the strip off entirely from supply lines or infrastructural grids or even trade routes. It is nevertheless relatively sealed off in a way that effectively turns it into an imprisoned territory. Comprehensive or relative closure is accompanied by periodic military escalations and the generalized use of extrajudicial assassination. Spatial violence, humanitarian strategies, and peculiar forms of collective punishment all then combine to produce, in turn, a peculiar carceral space in which people deemed surplus are governed through abdication of any responsibility for their lives and their welfare. So, this is, I suggest, a laboratory of forms we see replicated, not exactly in the same terms, but underpinned by the same logic in many different places of our world today. Take, for instance, what's going on in black ghettos in the United States of America. So, if you want, there's a war going on, a war on mobility. Not everyone's mobility, but the mobility of people who are deemed to be surplus. This form of warfare is driven by a peculiar kind of affect I would like to call a racist affect, which is definitely a key component of the current world climate. So you'll ask me, what is a racist affect? A racist affect is partly about how negative and dark emotions circulate between bodies, but bodies taken as signs of strangeness. The work racist affect does is to isolate such bodies, to tear them apart from other bodies, until a point where this separation and this tearing apart reaches a moment of maximal intensity. In the current climate and atmosphere, we can witness such moments of maximal intensity at various borders of our world. A racist affect is about the disrupting encounter with a body that is not mine, a face that is not mine, a body and a face whose difference or alterity vividly interpellates me, a body and a face I refuse to recognize as made in the image of my own body and of my own face, a face and a body which profoundly disturbs me, even shocks me, to the point where, in relation to it, I'm likely to always act irrationally. I'm likely to always act compulsively and in a destructive manner. And this compulsion to act in a destructive manner, this willful misrecognition of the other's face, this urge to mistreat the other's body, to inflict injury to the self of the other, this is the kind of work borders are expected to perform in most parts of the world today. All of the above belongs to the current practice of remote borderization, carried out from afar in the name of freedom and security and identity. This battle, waged against certain undesirables, is rolled out on a global scale. It is on the verge of defining the times in which we live, and it raises two broad questions that I think will confront us, will haunt us for most of this century. On the one hand, the question of life futures, and on the other, the future of reason as such. Let me end this presentation with some comments on Africa in this global regime of mobility. I am worried that Europe's anti-immigration policies end up turning Africa into a huge Bantustan. It is true that of all the regions of the world, Africa is one that has not entirely completed its demographic transition. And there are all kinds of reasons for this. By the end of this century, Africa will have more young people than any other region of the planet. Not all of them will be running away to Europe. I believe that we urgently need to open the continent to itself and engineer a new cycle of repeopling it. After all, it's a colossal landmass of 30 million square kilometers, which can still house people. In fact, it is arguably the last portion of the earth that can still sustain huge human migrations. Most migrants in Africa do not dream about coming to Europe. They are moving from one African country to another African country. The same observation counts in regard to refugees, those fleeing wars, disasters, and catastrophes. We should stop peddling the myth according to which Europe is about to be besieged by African refugees and economic migrants. What we should keep firmly in mind is that Europe is fast becoming the biggest reservoir of all the people on earth. Many right-wing and white supremacist forces in the world are seized by the fear of what they call the Great Replacement, a conspiracy theory that might rekindle the ugliest forms of white racism on a planetary scale. Now, even if Europe wanted to hermetically close its doors, I think it's simply too late to do so. Maybe this should have been done long ago, and yet, as we know, Europe then was busy colonizing other lands, and one cannot really close one's doors while forcefully plundering other people's lands and wealth. Whatever the case, were Europe genuinely determined to close itself off from the rest of the world, or from Africa in particular, the consequences would be colossal. Europe would have to implement deadly policies, which, by the way, are already somewhat experimented with in those laboratories that the Mediterranean Sea and the Sahara Desert have become. According to various figures, something like 34,000 people have already lost their lives over the last few years trying to cross the Mediterranean. The choice, it seems to me, is clear, and I'll end there. It is between cynically embracing the full consequences of a creeping paragenocidal policy or imagining together different ways of reorganizing the world and redistributing the planet among all its inhabitants, humans and non-humans. Indeed, a key issue of the 21st century will be the management of human mobility. The concept of human mobility is a bit more than what has been dubbed in Europe as the migration crisis. Human mobility is a key dimension of the planetary shifts that are underway. They include migrations, of course, but they are also related to many other factors propelled by the technological acceleration, the speed with which our world is moving, the unleashing of all kinds of predatory forces, the rise of bio and high-tech racism, the deteriorating conditions of life on Earth, and environmental change. This having been said, if Europe is really keen to contribute positively to resolving this great issue of our century, which is the question of human mobility, the key is not to spend money building camps and prisons in Libya or in its own midst. Europe should put money into, for instance, the harmonization of identity registers in the continent, the gradual dismantling of thousands of internal borders in the continent, massive investments in upgrading roads, building transcontinental railways, highways, consolidating water and river navigation. That is how the future will be brought back, and no African will want to live or end in a place where they know nobody, when nobody is waiting for them and where they are not welcome. Thank you very much for your attention.